Okay, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Chris Simpson, Programs Lead at Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. We are so glad you're all here for another installment of Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center's Book Talk. This virtual series focuses on recently published books related to our work on Holocaust education, defending human rights, and combating anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of hate. We are excited to have Jack Fairweather on this evening's program, who will speak about his book, The Prosecutor. A special thank you to the Jewish Book Council. Both Jack and FSWC are members of the organization. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so folks who are unable to attend today can watch at a later date. You are welcome to submit your questions using the chat function throughout the program, and we will do our best to get to them during the Q&A portion of the evening. I'm proud to be joined by my colleague, Robert Sarner, senior editor and writer at the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center and host of Book Talk. On that note, I will hand it over to you, Robert.
Thank you so much, Chris. And hello, everyone. And thank you for joining us this evening for this latest edition of FSWC's Book Talk series and the third installment, actually, in our fall season. I'm thrilled to have with us this evening our featured author today, Jack Fairweather, who's joining us live from his home in Vermont. We'll be discussing his recent nonfiction book, The Prosecutor, whose subtitle is One Man's Battle to Bring Nazis to Justice. Later in our program, as Chris just mentioned, we plan to take questions from the audience for Jack, so please use your chat box at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions you have for Jack. During the Q&A, we'll also be giving everyone the chance to win a free copy of The Prosecutor. It's part of our contest that involves questions relating to the book, courtesy of Jack's publisher, Crown Publishing, a division of Penguin Random House. Will be giving away 4 copies of The Prosecutor. Before beginning our conversation, I'm going to first read to you a brief bio for Jack, who has deservedly received rave reviews for The Prosecutor. And I don't say deservedly just to be nice. I finished reading the book myself this past weekend, and I can certainly tell you it's extremely engaging, highly informative, and masterfully written. So now, for those of you who are not already familiar with this evening's guest, this will help you know Jack Fairweather a little bit better. Born in England, Jack is a former war reporter in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the best-selling author of a half-dozen nonfiction books. While serving as the Daily Telegraph's bureau chief in Baghdad, he survived a suicide bombing, a kidnapping attempt, and numerous mortar attacks. His war coverage earned him a British Press Award and an Overseas Press Club Award citation. Jack now lives a quieter life as an author of historical works, dividing his time between Vermont and Wales. His previous books include The Volunteer, a biography about Witold Pilecki, a Polish resistance fighter who volunteered to infiltrate Auschwitz during the Holocaust so he could report on Nazi atrocities. Translated into 25 languages, The Volunteer won the 2019 Costa Book Award. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Jack to Book Talk.
Hello. Thank you, Robert. Great to be here.
And thank you, Jack, for taking the time to be with us here this evening. Before we start our discussion, I just want to mention that as much as we may think we already know about the Holocaust and Nazi Germany, I'm sure that if you read The Prosecutor, you will discover things you weren't aware of. I certainly did. Jack, I'd like to begin our Q&A, as I usually do with our featured authors, by asking you to first give our audience, in your own words, a brief description of The Prosecutor.
Thanks, Robert. Well, I think probably like a lot of you in the audience tonight, for myself, before I began researching and writing this book, the idea of justice at the end of World War II started and stopped with Nuremberg. You may have seen the film lately, and it was this defining moment when justice was brought to the Nazi leadership. And for many, that was the end of the story. And my book, The Prosecutor, is about this startling, dark, in many ways sordid world of post-war Germany in which 8.5 million former Nazi Party members found themselves being reintegrated into society, many of them with blood on their hands. It was the start of the Cold War. The Americans, after Nuremberg, wanted to turn a blind eye to the crimes of the past in the name of battling the Soviet Union. And my book is a biography of one man who decided that wasn't good enough. His name was Fritz Bauer. He was a gay Jewish lawyer who incredibly had survived the Nazis and grown up in Stuttgart in Germany, survived incarceration, survived being chased around Europe, in order to come back to Germany with a mission to force a national reckoning. For Bauer, it wasn't enough that 22 defendants stood trial at Nuremberg. He wanted Germany as a whole to reckon with its crimes, because only then would he, as a gay Jewish man, be safe in the place that he wanted to still call home. So this is the story of how one man bent the arc of history towards justice, and a powerful reminder, I think, for us today of the way in which individuals can really transform the direction of a society. In Bauer's case, he lifted the country out of fascism and authoritarianism. Lots of lessons for us today.
I'm sure, Jack, when you were contemplating doing this book, you knew it would be an enormous commitment on your part. I'm curious what prompted you to write the book, or perhaps more specifically, what drew you to the story of Fritz Bauer?
So I was a war reporter in Iraq and Afghanistan for over a decade, covering those two wars. At the end of which I found myself chatting with a fellow war reporter trying to transition out of wars. He had just come back from Auschwitz and heard this story about a resistance cell in the camp that was so surprising and shocking to me. And many years later, having had that seed planted, I learned who ran that resistance cell. It was a guy called Witold Pilecki. You mentioned him as my previous book, who a Polish resistance fighter who volunteered for a mission to report on Nazi crimes in Auschwitz. A plug for that book. Great, great, amazing, true story of heroism in a very dark time. But what I found myself doing at the end of the book was writing the dramatis personae lists, looking through the names of all the perpetrators, what happened to them at the end of the war. The book, The Volunteer, was about one man's call for justice. What I discovered in writing about the perpetrators of Auschwitz is that most of them went on to live absolutely comfortable, prosperous lives in post-war Germany. And even more shocking to me was the fact that they carried on in some of the very careers that they had practiced, if that's the right word, in the camp. The pharmacist of Auschwitz became the pharmacist of a small town, Göppingen. The doctors who had performed selections on the ramp at Birkenau took up medical practices in post-war West Germany. Then I began to notice something. Justice did come to these perpetrators, albeit 20 years after the war. And there was a common denominator in how they were brought to justice. It was this guy, Fritz Bauer, who piqued my interest. Who was Fritz Bauer to bring these men finally to justice? And that led me to Bauer's story, which seemed as incredible to me as Pilecki's in the way in which Bauer had to escape the Nazis, the way he fashioned his vision for justice, the courage it took him, and I think this is the defining point. It's the start of the book, is the point at which he's boarding a train to return to Germany with the idea that he's going to bring hundreds, thousands of Nazis to justice. Incredibly brave man, and one I'm really excited to share with everyone tonight.
To give our audience a better sense of the backdrop to the book, I'd like to read the opening paragraph of the book's introduction, which for me really set the stage for what follows. So I happen to have a copy of the book here, and I'm going to read literally the opening words of your book, the introduction. Imagine a history of the 20th century in which the Holocaust is only a footnote to the Second World War, where the encyclopedia entry for Auschwitz describes the flourishing chemical industry in the nearby town, but omits the gas chambers, where school textbooks describe Hitler as, quote, gifted in a variety of ways, unquote, and limit the discussion of the mass murder he orchestrated to just 47 words, concluding that, quote, no more than 100 people knew about it, unquote. This isn't an abstract thought experiment. This was West Germany in the years following Hitler's defeat, when the Holocaust was all but forgotten and the Allies sanctioned the return of millions of former Nazis to forge a new country to serve as a bulwark against communism. It was time, in the words of West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer in 1949, to quote, let bygones be bygones. This book is the story of Fritz Bauer, the remarkable Jewish prosecutor who, with a small band of activists, lawyers, and survivors, resolved that Germany and the world should not forget. And I will say that the subsequent pages, all 350 of them, certainly lives up to that opening paragraph. So Jack, you obviously did a tremendous amount of research. It's so rich with information, historical backdrop, even anecdotes. I'm wondering if during all this research you did anything surprise you in what you uncovered?
Well, I think there was a key to unlocking Bauer's story, which was his personal life, one which he had very carefully kept hidden. And it's a sort of shocking fact to me that the Allies, after the Second World War, stripped out almost all Nazi-era legislation from the German statute books, except the laws set in place by Himmler in 1935, persecuting gay men, some of the most extreme laws that had ever been set in place. And Bauer, as a gay man, was leaving Denmark, where he'd spent his some of the war in exile, which had liberalized laws, to West Germany, which had this extremely strict edicts in place, which meant that if his private life became public in any way, he would be out of his job, mission over, he would be facing years and years and hard labor. So a really terrifying prospect, which meant, of course, that the secret of his personal life was very closely guarded. And I think what was just really extraordinary for me was being able to unlock the story of his life in Denmark. I would love to just share a couple of images with you, just to give viewers an idea of my process and some of the sort of research that went into the into the book. So I'll just share my screen for a moment and uh, take you to a picture of Bauer, just so everyone can see who he is. Here he is as in his early 30s, having fled the Nazis. And what we discovered in the Danish archives was a cache of letters between him and his friends back in Stuttgart, where he was from, written whilst he was in exile in Copenhagen, detailing his love life. And he wrote more freely because he wrote some in code, also in Suterlin script. So I don't know if any of your viewers know Suterlin, but my German researcher Ingrid just could not make any sense of these letters at all. We knew here was, something private that Bauer was wanting to share, but we just had no way of knowing what was written until my researcher Ingrid thought about sharing them with her mum, her 90-year-old mum, Hedy. Here she is earlier this year. And it turned out Hedy, who was able to read handwritten Suterlin, and she and Ingrid all worked with me, and we managed to crack the code of these letters, which revealed this playful, intimate, caring, charismatic side to Bauer, one that had never been revealed before. And just a really poignant moment in the research because Ingrid's mum, Hedy, who you see here, she had grown up under the Nazis. In fact, her dad had been a Nazi administrator of occupied Poland. And so the idea or the fact that this daughter of the Nazis, was helping uncode the love life of one of the great Jewish heroes of the Second World War was incredibly poignant to us both. And I'll just take you to one other scene, which is just the dream of every biographer. Here is one of the men that one of Bauer's lovers, a guy called Paul Wagner. We tracked down his daughter in Denmark, Hella, very lovely lady, and we sort of were having a cup of tea. This is a picture from that meeting, and she said, "Oh, you know what? I think we've got some boxes up in the attic of letters from Fritz." And of course, she went up and grabbed them, these dusty boxes that no one had looked at in years and years. And of course, they were more love letters of Bauer's. And, it just allowed us to piece together this incredible new side to Bauer, which was to have real weight in the story of his life. I mean, I think we'll come on to in a moment, like what would make this man return to Germany. These letters showed us that in Denmark he found love, and that was really important to him and very shocking to him as someone who'd grown up during the rise to power of the Nazis, spent much of his early 20s battling the Nazis in the streets of Stuttgart as a young activist, lawyer, and judge. And here he was finding self-expression because Denmark was and still is one of the most liberal countries in Europe, and a very special moment that we got to unlock during our research. So anyway, that's a deep dive into our research. I love to meet family members. I love to meet survivors, increasingly rare, of course, to be able to do that. And I make sure that I go through every archive that there is, combing through the material because, what I want to offer readers is an immersive experience into the life of the people that I write about. I really wanted people to sort of understand the texture and the nuance of the world Bauer was lived in, because I think that is what really helps us see his quiet acts of heroism and really appreciate who he was and what he had to sacrifice in his quest for justice.
As you know, Jack, many German Holocaust survivors after the war, refused to return to Germany, given what the Germans had done. Why do you think Fritz Bauer, as you mentioned, he was in exile in Scandinavia during the Holocaust, he decided, albeit a few years after the war ended, not immediately after, but he ultimately did decide to come back to Germany. I'm sure with some maybe reservations and mixed feelings. Why do you think he did ultimately decide to come back to Germany?
Well, I think there were two sides to his quest to justice. I think there's one that we can all relate to. Bauer had had his whole life destroyed by Nazism. When he returned back to Germany, his family home, his parents' textile business destroyed, relatives killed, friends killed. The world of of Jewish life in Germany ruined. Along with 15 years of his career spent in prison, in concentration camps, on the run, in exile, lost as well. And it's quite easy to understand, I think, where his passion for justice came from, in part driven by anger at what had been done to him, what had been done to Jews, what had been done to Germany. And that's in some ways makes him similar to people like Simon Wiesenthal and other Nazi hunters, that passion for justice being driven by a sense of outrage at what had been done. Bauer had another element to this vision for justice, one which I think is so striking and surprising in many ways, and all the more audacious. For Bauer, it wasn't simply enough to bring Nazis to the dock and have them answer to their crimes. He wanted to use that process of justice to transform the country. He wanted to use the courts to force Germans to examine the roots of Nazism in German culture. It's a huge, incredible idea in many ways, very audacious of this one man returning to a sort of tiny job in a small provincial town to think that he might be able to change a whole culture. And that's the striking thing. That's why his story is so compelling. And my thesis in the book is that experience in Denmark, that sort of discovery of what life could be like without bigotry and hatred, really informed his vision for what Germany could become if it could confront its past. And it was one hell of a gamble, one hell of a risk. I mean, when he took a small job as a district judge at first in Braunschweig, small city. And he was surrounded by former Nazis. This was in 1949, just into the beginning of West Germany, in which tens of thousands of Nazi perpetrators were being brought back into different jobs in government. The chief of police in Braunschweig, the man who was sort of presenting with cases, was a former SS officer who had deported Jews and Poles to Auschwitz in Krakow. One of his prosecutors had signed several thousand death warrants to euthanize disabled children in the area. This was a time when he wandered into a bookshop and overheard his colleagues in the courthouse saying, "Oh, that Fritz Bauer, he should have been gassed too." It just incredible courage, slightly mad and feverish and passionate vision that that could change. And I just find that very compelling to follow that story from that, from that lowly beginning in a devastated war-torn country to where he finally got to bring the country.
Given how incredible the story of Bauer is, why do you think it's not better known?
Well, it's the case that Bauer having, I mean, we'll come back to the ways in which he transformed German society, but you can be sure that the Jewish guy who told his fellow Germans, "You're a bunch of Nazis, you need to face up to your complicity in the crimes of the Holocaust," was not the most popular man in in Germany. And it's sad to say that when he died in 1968, a number of things happened. One was prosecutions of Nazis tapered off massively. Second thing was that yeah, like a great deal of his legacy was forgotten in those immediate years after his death. And what happened though was that he had planted a seed with the generation of 1968, the emerging generation, that he had given them what they needed to know about the crimes of their parents in order to seed this transformation. And it's really not until the 90s in Germany that Bauer began to be recognized for his incredible exploits in Germany. And, as is often the case, we in the West, in North America, US, Canada, like we lag a bit behind that story again. And it is a bit surprising to me that, I in 2025, I got to be the first person to publish the English language biography of who Fritz Bauer was, and this incredible seminal figure in our 20th century reckoning with the Holocaust. But this history does take time to unwind, and it's precisely why we need to keep exploring the past. I think Bauer's whole life was about the need for a reckoning, to keep confronting the crimes of the Nazis, and that's on us to keep that flame going and finding the stories that help us understand that time and also understand our present moment.
In the book, in writing about the Nuremberg trials, the prospect of other future trials of other Nazi war criminals, and Bauer's response, you write on page 87, I'm going to read this because I thought it was an interesting what you wrote here. Quote, most judges insisted on sticking to the traditional German penal code that only allowed defendants to be tried for individual cases of murder to avoid the appearance of retroactive justice. Further complicating the matter, the German code included a Nazi-era provision that required proof of base, cruel, or sadistic motives in murder cases to provide cover for those killed in the name of the state. The courts were allowing hundreds of Nazi perpetrators to walk free, simply claiming that they had only been following orders. For Bauer, it was clear such leniency stemmed from the Allies' original decision to bring back Nazi-era judges at the expense of committed resistors like himself, unquote. So my question on that is, were the cards stacked against Bauer in his quest to use the law to address Germany's past and bring former Nazis to justice?
They absolutely were, and it's I think this was a real hinge point in the story of the reckoning with the Holocaust, in that Nuremberg, one of the reasons why it was so extraordinary was that it brought into international law ideas like crimes against humanity, concepts like genocide, which, hitherto had not existed and were applied against the Nazi leadership. And they actually struck out the idea that you could defend yourself by saying, I was only following orders. And so that was in 1945. Fast forward to 1949, when Bauer was returning to work and the West German state was beginning. They had a choice. The Allies and the new leaders of West Germany, should they accept the provisions of Nuremberg into German legal code, or should they revert to the old laws? And of course, the old laws, we're talking about, how do you try murder, before the advent of mass murder? How do you try genocide when no one has ever thought that something like that was possible? And of course, the Allies, the West German government, decided we won't have genocide and crimes against humanity recognized in the German legal code. We'll go back to the old provisions, because quite simply, it made it very hard, if not impossible, to try the crimes of the Holocaust. Because how do you charge someone who ran the gas chambers of Auschwitz with a single murder? That operator of the gas chamber might have, led tens of thousands to their deaths, but under the old German laws, which became set in stone in West Germany, the only way to prove a murder was by proving a single murder. And, how do you do that? How do you say, how do you identify a single act of murder in industrialized mass murder? Incredibly difficult, and a real battle that Bauer faced. It's worth also saying that what the Allies chose to do at the advent of the Cold War was to stand up the West German state as quickly as possible. That meant getting the judicial system up and running as quickly as possible. That meant bringing back Nazi-era judges. And by the time that Bauer took up his job in Braunschweig, over half the courts were stacked with Nazi-era judges who had enforced things like the Nuremberg race laws, who had given orders for judicial executions of, disabled children, and they had no interest in trying fellow Nazis. And when cases did come to the attention of the courts, as you just read, Robert, like, it was very easy to say, where's the proof that you carried out a single murder? And it was the case that some Einsatzgruppen commanders, men who had led squads of men in the machine gunning of thousands in places like Lithuania and Russia, they were brought to court, and they tried to bring individual murder cases against them, and you can imagine how difficult that was. And that's to say nothing, of course, of the fact that those crimes took place behind the Iron Curtain in many cases, really hard to gather evidence. Another little facet that made life difficult for Bauer was the fact that the West German government banned contact between prosecutors in West Germany with those in East Germany and any Eastern Bloc country because of the Cold War, ostensibly, but in reality, it was to stop evidence reaching people like Bauer that they could use to make it hard to find witnesses, survivors. So to say that the system was stacked against Bauer, it almost sort of feels like you're selling it short. I mean, this was, one man versus the state, and it was, it is kind of mind-blowing that he managed to achieve what he did in given those circumstances.
As you write in the book, Jack, in the 1950s, the West German intelligence service knew where Adolf Eichmann was living in Argentina, but showed little interest in pursuing him. How did Bauer come to play such a central role in Eichmann's eventual capture by the Mossad in 1960, which you document very well in the book?
So, I mean, this is one of the great moments in which Bauer managed to sort of break out of the trap that he had walked in many ways, and he realized that the only way to capture public attention would be by finding a major Nazi war criminal. And he took up a job in Frankfurt in 1956, and it just by a sort of chance. I mean, he knew he was looking for a war criminal to track down. He on his desk on his first day was a folder with the names of war criminals that the Austrian government was seeking to pass off to West Germany. In 1956, Austria was gaining its independence, and as some of you, many of you, those in the audience will know, Austria decided to style itself as Hitler's first victim of the First World War, and couldn't, and sort of disown any Nazis and just say they were Germans. And on that list was a name unknown to most people in the world at the time, Adolf Eichmann, known to Bauer, of course, because of his intimate knowledge of the Holocaust, and Eichmann had gone missing at the end of the war. Eichmann, just for those who don't know, was one of the main orchestrators of the final solution, who arranged for the deportation of Jews from across Europe to death camps like Auschwitz. He had gone missing at the end of the war, and here was his criminal file and the right to investigate on Bauer's desk. And so, yeah, Bauer did a bit of a sort of Hail Mary. He held a press conference and said, "I'm after Eichmann," and because he had no real leads. The Austrian police had done absolutely zero with the case in the preceding years. And this is just one of these incredible moments in history that just you can't quite believe they're real, because they just seem so sort of fictional in a way. But 7,000 miles away in Buenos Aires, there was a blind Holocaust survivor who was having the morning newspapers read to him by his 14-year-old daughter. His name was Lothar Hermann, and his daughter was Sylvia. And they read a small little piece in the sort of the main Argentinian German Jewish newspaper, and it was about this press conference Bauer had, just a couple of paragraphs mentioning Adolf Eichmann, and that name rang a bell for Lothar and Sylvia, because just a few months before, Sylvia had brought back a young man to dinner who she had been dating, who introduced himself as Nicholas Eichmann, and who, during the dinner, not knowing that Sylvia and her dad were Jewish, went on to say, in talking about his dad, that he had had an important job traveling around Europe. And then he went on to say all the Jews should have been killed. And so Lothar, Sylvia were like, put the two and two together and said, "Oh my gosh, is this Nick Eichmann, the son of this Adolf Eichmann. And so they wrote to Bauer and said, "We think we have a lead for you." And um, given everything we've been talking about, Robert, in terms of how difficult, how limited was the room of maneuver for Bauer, you will understand that he did not um, seek to tell the West German authorities that he had a lead on Eichmann, because he knew that if he told the police, they would almost certainly tip off Eichmann and he would get away. And so, and it's a real sort of shows the just the mad world in which Bauer was working in. He used Lothar and Sylvia became his agents on the ground. He's got them to hunt down Eichmann and confirm his identity. It was that 14-year-old girl. I'd just like to share an image with you for a moment here, because I just want you to see, yeah, with this amazing duo, Bauer's secret agents team in Argentina, Lothar and Sylvia. It was Sylvia you see there who knocked on the door to the Eichmann home, and it was answered by a middle-aged man with a sort of long, spindly nose. And Sylvia said, "Are you Nick Eichmann's dad?" And he took a pause for a moment and then said, "Yes, I am." And that was the amazing moment in which Adolf Eichmann was identified and his journey to justice finally began. Here's a photograph that was taken when Mossad got involved, because of course Bauer knew that having identified Eichmann and where he lived, he couldn't go to the West German authorities. The only people he knew who could be trusted with this information was Mossad. And this was incredible images when you think of it. Photographs taken from the briefcase of a Mossad agent that helped to identify Eichmann. And
so, Jack, as you say in the book, then Bauer, as you said, not being able to trust anyone in the West German intelligence to follow up on this lead about Eichmann, that he then reached out, I believe, through a rabbi to contact the senior Israeli diplomat in West Germany at the time. Through that diplomat, then the information was passed on to the Mossad back in Israel. But as you mentioned in the book, Israel was initially reluctant to actually pursue Eichmann. And that obviously was very frustrating to Bauer. Here he is trying to make it possible, the capture of Eichmann and bringing him to justice. And of all people, the Israelis were reluctant to actually act on it. So clearly he was very frustrated. What was his response to that situation?
yeah, well, I think it's worth just dwelling on that sort of extraordinary fact, not least because, of course, I think many of you will have watched, the film about the capture of Eichmann, and it sort of presents, this heroic vision of like, oh, there's Eichmann, let's get him, and I mean, amazing heroism in capturing him, but it sort of cuts out this, yeah, very, very sort of poignant moment in that's worth dwelling on, which is not, it wasn't just West Germany that didn't want to confront the crimes of the Nazis. It was a sort of global phenomenon, and this is why Bauer's story is so important for us. He's not just a German hero; he's really a sort of hero of the Holocaust, because no one was talking about the crimes of the Holocaust then. Writers like Primo Levi, struggling to get his book translated and published, said in 1955, "No one wants to talk about the concentration camps. I better be quiet." And in the case in Israel, of course, it wasn't that people didn't know what the Holocaust was. So many Holocaust survivors had found a home there. But in the new country of Israel, there was little desire to talk about the Holocaust, even there, because it really cut against the heroic vision of the birth of the nation that the country's leaders were trying to build, one in which it was, the heroic man of destiny, or woman of destiny, building Israel, and they didn't want to talk about that disturbing past in which, in the words of many, thousands of Jews had walked, like lambs, sheep to the slaughter, as it was put at the time. And so when Bauer presented this extraordinary bombshell that he had identified where Eichmann was, the head of Mossad, Issa Harel, said, we're not really interested in tracking down old Nazis. That's the past. We're interested in the future. And Bauer really struggled with that. Mossad did perform a sort of what could best be described as a half-assed investigation, but clearly weren't interested in capturing him. And it actually took Bauer, he made another trip to Israel, which, for context, Bauer, a official of the West German government, flying to Mossad, spy agency of a foreign power, to seek the arrest of a German national. I mean, that would have, in the context of West Germany at that time, Bauer would have been sacked and probably charged with treason for what he was doing. So very high risk stuff. And he said to Harel, if you don't capture Eichmann, I will go public with this. And that may mean that Eichmann gets away, but you will have questions to answer about why you let one of the greatest mass murderers in human history walk away. And there's a note in David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli Prime Minister's diary, following that meeting, because Issa Harel, the Mossad chief, went to see him. And Ben-Gurion says, I think you should do what Bauer asks. And so Bauer basically is orchestrating this whole thing behind the scenes and playing what cards he has and taking huge risks to do it. And yet, he succeeds in creating that moment that was to change the history of the Holocaust, which was the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, which, is a point of history I know lots of your viewers will know about. Just this moment when at last survivors were given a platform to speak about what had happened, and this sort of faith that Bauer carried really throughout his career, that if the truth comes out, if the truth can be heard, it will change how people see history. And, that is such a powerful message for us today. And, it was powerful to the world at the time, because those survivor stories told from the witness stand was what finally cut through global indifference and brought the Holocaust home to so many people.
Just a reminder that in a short while, we're going to be taking a few questions from the audience for Jack. So if you have any questions, please do put them now in the chat box. Before we take those questions, as I mentioned earlier in the program, we do want to give away 4 free copies of The Prosecutor. And to do that, we're going to be asking 4 questions. And for each question, the first person to answer accurately will win a free copy of the book. And please write your answers in the chat box. And I'm going to now turn to the questions. I had, by the way, many more questions for Zach, but I see the time. We're getting a bit tight, so I did want to get to the contest. Okay, the first question. How many Germans joined the Nazi Party starting in the 1920s until the fall of Nazi Germany in 1945? Question 2. What percentage of votes did the Nazi Party receive the first time it ran in a national election in Germany? Question 3. We talked about how much was West Germany's judicial system actually willing to prosecute Nazi war criminals in the years after the Holocaust. So the question is, in 1949, there were nearly 4,000 indictments not convictions, against Nazi perpetrators. How many indictments were there in 1955, 6 years later? And the fourth question, we didn't really have a chance to talk very much, unfortunately for reasons of time, about the famous Auschwitz trial that Bauer was the driving force behind in the early 60s. But of the nearly 24 defendants in Bauer's Auschwitz trial that began in 1963 and ended 2 years later in 1965, how many of those nearly 24 defendants recognized the suffering that they had caused at the infamous death camp of Auschwitz and offered anything like an apology? So those are the 4 questions. I'll give you another minute or so to post your responses in the chat box before I read the correct answers. So please get those answers in. And now I will turn to the answers. We'll see how many of you actually got the answers correct. So again, question number 1. How many Germans joined the Nazi Party starting in the 1920s until the fall of Nazi Germany in 1945? So the correct answer, and actually Jack mentioned it without knowing it was one of the questions. He actually mentioned it at the outset. We'll see how many of you were sharp to catch it when Jack referred to it. But the answer is, by the end of World War II, approximately 8.5 million Germans were members of the party. The number had grown from 55,000 members in 1923 to 850,000 when the Nazis came to power in 1933, and to more than 6 million in 1939. Question 2, what percentage of votes did the Nazi Party receive the first time it ran in a national election in Germany? The answer, in May 1928, 5 years before it came to power, the Nazi Party won 2.6% of the vote in its first national election. In November 1932, in the last free elections before the Nazis seized power the following year, they received 33% of the vote, more than any other party. Okay, question 3, we talked about how much was West Germany's judicial system actually willing to prosecute Nazi war criminals in the years after the Holocaust. In 1949, there were nearly 4,000 indictments, not convictions, against Nazi perpetrators. How many indictments were there 6 years later in 1955? The answer, only 27. And as Jack writes in the book on page 140, quote, prosecutors sat on cases for years. Local police tipped off suspects ahead of planned arrests, and witnesses and documentary evidence of wartime crimes were hard to find, as West German authorities had imposed an embargo on contact, as Jack mentioned earlier, with East European countries where many of the worst atrocities had taken place. Even motivated officials struggled to bring cases to court, unquote. And the last question, of the nearly 24 defendants in Bauer's Auschwitz trial, which began in 1963 and ended 2 years later in 1965, how many of the defendants recognized the suffering they had caused at Auschwitz and offered anything resembling an apology? The answer, as Jack indicates in the book, a grand total of 0. That's correct. During the trial, none of the defendants acknowledged having contributed to the atrocities at Auschwitz or expressed any contrition for their role. Before taking any questions from the audience, just one last question for Jack from me. And when Bauer died in June of 1968, as you mentioned in the book, he died actually in his bathtub. And since then, there have been some people who actually have put forward the theory that he was murdered. First of all, why would he have been murdered? And do you give that any credence, that theory?
I mean, there was a pretty thorough investigation carried out by a coroner after his death, which showed no foul play. It's easy to see how the theory took hold among some of Bauer's friends. At one stage, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer threatened Bauer that he would risk being dragged into the shadows if he continued with his investigation of senior members of his government that included people like Hans Globke, his right-hand man, one of the key framers of the Nuremberg race laws, whom had played a central role in reintegrating Nazis into the West German state. So Bauer's phone ran through the night with threatening calls, some orchestrated by the government, some just from cranks and far-right folk who, constantly threatened him. He got bullets in the mail. There many wished him dead. The tragic truth, which I think is poignant incredibly poignant, is that he died most likely from a heart attack and from dedicating his life 18 hours a day, round the clock, pursuing Nazi war criminals. And the fact that he died alone in his bathtub tells us the toll that battle took on him. And I think that's, it's an arresting moment because it reminds us just of what it took to make Germany face up to its crimes. And, we talked about the Eichmann trial. I would just like to touch briefly on the Auschwitz trial, Robert, that you mentioned, and which was the sort of crowning achievement of Bauer's career in many ways, because following the Eichmann trial, Bauer set about creating an even bigger and more ambitious proceeding. No one was talking about Auschwitz in the early 1960s. Eichmann trial, hugely impactful for revealing the Holocaust to the world, but it fell into a sort of trap that Bauer was all too familiar with, in which Germans were able to say, oh, it was just fanatics like Eichmann that carried out the Holocaust. And Bauer knew that wasn't the case. He knew that the real horror of Nazism was the fact it had been carried out by ordinary Germans, and hence why he had this idea of holding a trial that would put Auschwitz at the center of proceedings, not the leadership of Auschwitz, not the decision makers in Berlin, but the people who actually operated the gas chambers, the people who drove the trucks, who worked in the hospital, the cleaners, the guards. In many ways, the quote, ordinary Germans that made mass murder possible. And incredibly powerful vision, and one that he managed to pull off. And he made Germans look at those defendants and recognize themselves in the dock in a way that they hadn't been able to do at Nuremberg or hadn't been able to do in the Eichmann trial. And I'd just like to leave you with, like a image I think will be familiar to all of you, but what I hope in a way becomes strange and incredible in the book. This is the Arbach-Freigate. We're so familiar with this picture. For people around the world in 1963, 64, when the trial was unfolding, they were not familiar with this image. They didn't know what those words meant. Likewise, here they are at the death wall. This is some television footage of the gas chambers in Birkenau. And again, people just, had never connected the place to the idea before. Auschwitz was in Poland behind the Iron Curtain. Westerners didn't go there. There was no sort of tourist industry as there is today. Had been no films, no, popular books describing the Holocaust. And so when that image of the gate, when these television images were broadcast around the world, people really seeing Auschwitz for the first time. And it is just such a powerful legacy that Bauer has left us. Because it's this idea that when we confront the truth, when we see the place itself, when we hear the survivors speak, we are going to be changed by that experience. And it's true that none of the defendants said they were sorry. That's what Bauer reflected on at the end of the trial. I noticed one of your commentators in the thread did say that some expressed some remorse, which is true, but nothing near an apology that Bauer was perhaps hoping for. But what Bauer was doing was presenting these crimes not for the defendants to sort of change. He was presenting them to the next generation of Germans. And that courtroom in Frankfurt where the trial took place was filled with school groups, young students who came to attend, and they began asking the questions that hadn't been asked up until that point. What did you do, Dad, during the war? What did you do, Mum, during the war? And in a very simple way, like that, those questions were what sparked the beginning of the reckoning that Bauer could just glimpse in 1968, that summer he died, but had no idea just how successful he would be. Although I think his story is a warning to all of us that we can't take Holocaust knowledge for granted. Indeed, I think, the world around us today would be very familiar to Bauer in many ways. And he would be calling us to take up the fight that he fought for so many years.
Jack, for reasons of time, we're going to have to limit the questions from the audience. So I'll just take one question. And if you could, again, because of our where we are on the clock, to try to answer this briefly. Judy Chodderker in Toronto asks, she's curious if you're Jewish, and if so, did that have an impact? And if you're not Jewish, did that also have an impact in prompting you to write the book?
I'm not Jewish, and yeah, I think I was very conscious in approaching the story of this great Jewish hero to, make sure that I captured that quality of his and reflected on what this must have been like for him to trace these crimes that had been done to his family and friends that were so incredibly personal. And I think that's the power of Bauer's story, is that he wanted people who weren't Jewish to connect with this history. And I hope I've followed that call to action and will bring people both to Bauer's story, but of course what Bauer wanted us all to do, which was confront the crimes of the past.
Thank you, Jack Ranthony. And that does bring us to the close of this latest installment of FSWC's Book Talk series. I want to thank all of you for being with us here this evening, and of course, special appreciation to Jack, our featured guest.